The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the neatly trimmed lawns of Modesto, California. Danielle Rucker, her muscles aching pleasantly from a day spent helping her cousin move, pulled her SUV into her driveway. A wave of contentment washed over her, the familiar comfort of home after a long day. As she shifted the car into park, a flicker of movement caught her eye. A woman, standing on the opposite sidewalk, watched her with an unnerving intensity. Danielle frowned slightly, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. Is she lost? She wondered, but the woman made no move to approach. Maybe just a nosy neighbor. Danielle dismissed the feeling, chalking it up to her own weariness. She had more important things to worry about, like unpacking Rex and Nova, her two Belgian Malinois, from the back of the SUV. She pressed the button on her visor to open the garage door, the familiar rumble echoing in the quiet street. As the door began to lift, a different kind of rumble, deeper and more insistent, filled the air. Danielle glanced in her rearview mirror, and her breath hitched. A police cruiser, lights flashing, blocked her exit from the driveway. Confusion warred with a sudden spike of fear. What was going on? She thought, her mind racing to understand. Before she could process the situation, two more cruisers screeched to a halt, boxing her in. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the sudden, suffocating silence. Officers emerged from the vehicles, their hands resting on their holstered weapons. The late afternoon sun glinted off their badges, momentarily blinding Danielle. She blinked, trying to focus, her mind reeling. "Step out of the vehicle!" A voice barked, amplified by a megaphone. The command echoed in her ears, harsh and jarring. Danielle's hands trembled as she gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles turning white. A wave of dizziness washed over her, the world tilting on its axis. Step out of the vehicle? What have I done? The question screamed in her mind, a frantic whisper against the roaring fear that threatened to consume her. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. Not here. Not to her. The absurdity of the situation slammed into her, a cold, hard fist. She was a veteran, a decorated soldier who had served her country with honor, and now, in her own driveway, she was being treated like a criminal. The anger began to simmer, a slow burn beneath the fear. She knew, with a chilling certainty, that this wasn't about a broken taillight or a missed stop sign. This was about her skin, the color of her skin. Her gaze flickered to the woman across the street, now holding a phone to her ear, a smug satisfaction etched on her face. Understanding dawned, sharp and painful. She called them. The thought was a bitter pill, hard to swallow. This woman, this stranger, had deemed her suspicious, a threat, simply because she was black. "Ma'am, step out of the vehicle now!" The voice boomed again, laced with impatience. Danielle took a deep, shaky breath, forcing herself to focus. She had to stay calm. She had to think. She slowly unbuckled her seatbelt, her movements deliberate and controlled. "Don't give them a reason," she told herself, her inner voice a steady mantra against the chaos swirling around her. "Don't give them an excuse." As she reached the door handle, a low growl rumbled from the back of the SUV. Rex, sensing his owner's distress, pressed his massive body against the barrier separating the cargo area from the passenger seats. Nova, equally alert, whined softly, her eyes fixed on the officers outside. Danielle hesitated, her hand hovering over the door handle. She knew the presence of her dogs, two highly trained military working dogs, would only escalate the situation in the eyes of the police. Yet in that moment, their presence was the only thing that felt remotely familiar, remotely safe. "There are dogs in the vehicle," she called out, her voice trembling slightly. "Military working dogs. They are trained, but they are protective." One of the officers, a young Latino man with a tense jawline, lowered his megaphone slightly. Danielle caught a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, a brief moment of hesitation that gave her a sliver of hope. He exchanged a quick glance with another officer, a larger man with a stern, impassive face. "Ma'am, we need you to exit the vehicle slowly. Keep your hands visible at all times. the Latino officer instructed, his voice slightly less aggressive than before. Danielle nodded, her heart still pounding, but the fear beginning to recede, replaced by a steely resolve. She opened the door, her movements slow and deliberate, careful not to startle the dogs. Rex and Nova, sensing the shift in her demeanor, remained quiet, their watchful gaze fixed on the officers. As Danielle stepped out of the SUV, she saw an elderly man standing on his porch, his phone held steady in his hand. He was recording everything, a silent observer in a sea of escalating tension. Thank God, she thought, a fleeting prayer of gratitude. At least there would be a witness. At least there would be proof. The confrontation stretched on, each second ticking by like an eternity. The air crackled with unspoken tension, the setting sun painting the scene in long, ominous shadows. Danielle stood her ground, her back straight, her gaze steady, the quiet fury simmering beneath the surface. She knew, with a gut-wrenching certainty, that this was only the beginning. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across her driveway, painting the asphalt in hues of fading gold and encroaching gray. Danielle's keys, still clutched in her hand, felt cold against her skin, a stark contrast to the heat that was steadily rising in her chest. Confusion, a thick, disorienting fog, clung to her mind. My driveway. My house. What? The thought trailed off, unfinished, snagged on the unsettling reality of 4 police cruisers, their lights flashing like malevolent beacons, and the glint of metal in the hands of the officers who surrounded her. Each breath hitched in her throat, a physical manifestation of the fear that was beginning to coil in her stomach. Not the raw, visceral fear of immediate danger, but the insidious, slow-burning fear she'd learned to recognize in deployments overseas, the fear of the unknown, the unpredictable. She'd faced down armed insurgents in the dust and heat of a foreign land. Yet here, in her own driveway, in the supposed safety of her own neighborhood, she felt a chilling sense of vulnerability. "Ma'am, we got a call about a break-in." You matched the description. The voice, male, laced with a hint of suspicion, sliced through her thoughts. Description? The word echoed in her mind, a bitter taste forming on her tongue. What description? Black woman, existing? The thought was sharp, edged with the kind of weary cynicism she'd tried so hard to shed after leaving the service. It was the kind of cynicism born from years of subtle slights, from being followed in stores, from the constant, low-humming awareness that she was often perceived as a threat simply by virtue of her existence. "This is my house," she stated, her voice remarkably steady despite the tremor in her hands. She forced herself to meet the officer's gaze, refusing to cower. He was young, Latino, his face a study in conflicting emotions, suspicion warring with a flicker of something that looked almost like hesitation. She held his gaze for a beat longer than necessary, a silent challenge, a demand for recognition. "License and registration." The words were clipped, impatient. His eyes flicked to her hand, still clutching the keys, then back to her face. The hesitation was gone, replaced by a steely resolve. He shifted his weight, his hand tightening on his weapon. The absurdity of the situation threatened to overwhelm her. "License and registration? In my own driveway." After serving this country, she fumbled with her keys, the metal biting into her skin. Her military ID, tucked away in a small compartment of her wallet, felt heavy, a leaden weight in her palm. She presented it, along with her driver's license, a small, defiant act of resistance. He examined them, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the chirping of crickets and the distant hum of traffic. Time seemed to warp, each second expanding into an eternity. Her mind raced, replaying the events of the day. Grocery shopping, unpacking, a quick jog with Rex, and Nova nothing. Nothing that could possibly warrant this. The officer finally handed her documents back, his movements stiff. "We still need to confirm," he said, his voice devoid of warmth. A low growl rumbled from the back of her SUV. Rex, his keen senses, honed by years of military training, had picked up on the tension. Another growl, deeper this time, followed by the soft patting of paws. The officer's eyes flicked towards the vehicle, a flicker of apprehension crossing his face. "Good boy," she thought, a small, wry smile touching her lips. Without a word, her hand went to the lock of the dog crates, the familiar click echoing in the stillness. The back of the SUV swung open, and two massive Belgian Malinois emerged, their movements fluid and controlled. Rex, a brindle giant, and Nova, his sleek black counterpart, stepped onto the driveway, their tactical vests, clearly marked military canine, stark against their fur. They stood flanking her, silent, watchful, their presence a tangible shift in the dynamic. Rex let out a single, sharp bark, the sound echoing in the sudden quiet. It wasn't aggressive, but it was a clear statement, a declaration of territory, a warning. The young officer's eyes widened, his hand instinctively moving away from his weapon. He exchanged a look with his colleagues, a silent communication passing between them. The tension in the air, thick and suffocating just moments before, began to dissipate, replaced by something akin to townies. The setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, a surreal backdrop to the scene unfolding in her driveway. The world, just moments ago a place of fear and confusion, now felt tinged with a bitter irony. She stood there, flanked by her dogs, her military ID back in her wallet, a black woman, a veteran, in her own home, waiting for an explanation that she knew, deep down, would never truly suffice. The late afternoon sun cast long, distorted shadows across Danielle's driveway, turning the mundane concrete into a canvas of abstract art. She stood frozen, the weight of the pointed guns heavier than any physical burden she'd carried in her years of service. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drummer in a silent concert. "This isn't happening," a detached part of her mind whispered. "This isn't real." But the cold, hard steel glinting in the sunlight was undeniably real. So was the tremor in her hands, a betrayal of the stoic calm she fought to maintain. Rex and Nova, sensing her unease, pressed against her legs, their warm bodies a tangible anchor in the surreal nightmare unfolding. They hadn't barked, hadn't growled, just stood sentinel, their presence a silent declaration of their unwavering loyalty. Their vests, embroidered with military working dog, "Do not approach," caught the sunlight, reflecting it back into the officer's eyes. A subtle shift rippled through the line of officers. The rigid stances eased, the fingers on the triggers relaxed, the air of aggressive suspicion thinning like morning mist. One officer, a Latino man with a tired face etched with lines that spoke of a life spent witnessing too much, lowered his weapon completely. Officer Perez. Danielle remembered his name tag from the initial barrage of commands. He peeled away from the group, his gaze moving from the dogs to Danielle, then settling on the woman who stood behind the police cars, a blur of blonde hair and wide, frightened eyes. Kimberlyn Fulner. The neighbor Danielle had waved to just last week, the one who always clutched her purse a little tighter when their paths crossed. The one who now stood bathed in the orange glow of the setting sun, her face a mask of dawning horror. Danielle's mind raced, a whirlwind of confusion and burgeoning anger. They lowered their guns because of the dogs? The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. Not because she was a human being, a veteran, a homeowner, but because of the perceived threat posed by her dogs. The irony was a bitter pill to swallow, a caustic taste on her tongue. She tasted bile, the metallic tang of fear clinging to the back of her throat. She wanted to scream, to rage, to demand answers. But years of training, of discipline ingrained into her very being, held her voice captive. Only her eyes, dark pools reflecting the storm raging within, betrayed her inner turmoil. Officer Perez approached Kimberlyn, his voice low and steady, a stark contrast to the shouted orders of moments before. "Ma'am, can you tell me why you called 911? His question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken accusation. Danielle watched Kimberlyn fidget, her eyes darting between the officer, the dogs, and Danielle herself. Her hands twisted in the strap of her purse. A nervous tick Danielle had noticed before, amplified now to a frantic dance. Two saw her. Kimberlyn stammered, her voice thin and reedy, in the driveway with those dogs. Two didn't recognize her. The door was open, I thought. Her voice trailed off, the unspoken accusation hanging in the air thicker than the late afternoon humidity. I thought she was breaking in. You thought I was breaking into my own house. Danielle's voice, though quiet, cut through the tense silence like a shard of glass. The words hung in the air, vibrating with the suppressed fury she could no longer contain. The question wasn't really a question, it was a statement, an indictment. She held Kimberlyn's gaze, her own unwavering, demanding an answer, demanding acknowledgement. The air crackled with unspoken tension, a palpable energy that made the hairs on the back of Danielle's neck prickle. Kimberlyn flinched, her gaze dropping to the ground. Two didn't recognize you, she mumbled, the words barely audible. Danielle saw the tremor in her hands intensify, her knuckles white against the pale leather of her purse. The apology, if it could even be called that, lacked any real remorse, any true understanding of the gravity of the situation. It was a hollow echo, devoid of genuine contrition. She still doesn't get it, Danielle thought, the anger simmering beneath the surface of her forced composure. She doesn't see what she's done. Officer Perez sighed, the sound heavy with weariness. He ran a hand over his face, the fatigue etched in his features deepening. He turned back to Danielle, his gaze softening, a flicker of something akin to apology in his eyes. "Ms. Rucker," he said, his voice laced with a newfound respect, a stark contrast to the earlier bark commands, "You are not under arrest. We made a mistake." The admission, though quiet, reverberated through the stillness of the late afternoon, a crack in the edifice of authority, a fleeting glimpse of the vulnerability beneath the uniform. Danielle's breath hitched, a choked sound trapped in her throat. The relief that washed over her was so sudden, so intense, it almost buckled her knees. But the anger, the simmering resentment, remained, a hard knot in her stomach. A mistake. Two words that couldn't erase the fear, the humiliation, the raw injustice of what had just transpired. Two words that couldn't bridge the chasm of misunderstanding, of ingrained prejudice that separated her from her neighbor, from the officers who had pointed their guns at her, from the world that saw her skin color as a threat before they saw her humanity. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the chirping of crickets and the distant hum of traffic. The setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, a beautiful, indifferent backdrop to the raw, ugly scene playing out in her driveway. The world kept turning, oblivious to the seismic shift that had just occurred within her, a shift that would forever alter the landscape of her life. The muted hum of the refrigerator was the only sound breaking the stillness of her living room. Monday evening had settled over her like a heavy blanket, the kind that promised restless sleep and tangled dreams. Danielle sat on the worn sofa, the cushions still bearing the faint indentations of Rex and Nova, her two Belgian Malinois who now dozed by the patio door. The late afternoon sun, filtered through the blinds, cast stripes across the hardwood floor, a zebra pattern of light and shadow. She absently scrolled through her phone, the blue light reflecting in the dark pools of her eyes. A text message from her cousin, Shonda, flashed across the screen. "Girl, is it you in this video?" Followed by a link. Danielle's thumb hovered over the link, a strange premonition tightening her chest. It felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing the fall was inevitable, yet dreading the impact. What could it be? She wondered, the thought brushing against her unease like dry leaves rustling in the wind. Probably another silly TikTok trend, she tried to reassure herself, though a knot of apprehension remained. She tapped the link. The video began to play, the grainy footage flickering on her screen. Her breath hitched. It was her driveway, her house, her, standing there, hands raised, two German shepherds flanking her, their bodies taut, alert. Two Modesto police officers, guns drawn, pointed directly at her. At her. The image seared itself onto her retinas, a brand burning into her soul. She felt a coldness seep into her bones, a chilling echo of the fear she'd experienced just 2 days prior. Danielle watched the video again, and then again, each replay etching the scene deeper into her memory. The buzzing in her ears grew louder, drowning out the hum of the refrigerator, the chirping of crickets outside. It was surreal, watching herself from this detached perspective, like a character in a poorly written play. The absurdity of it all threatened to crack the carefully constructed composure she'd maintained throughout the ordeal. Her gaze fixed on the figure of a woman standing across the street, her arms crossed, an expression of detached indifference etched on her face. Kimberlyn Faulkner, the neighbor who had called 911. The woman who had looked at her, a black woman standing in her own driveway, unloading groceries from her car with 2 leash dogs, and seen a threat. The woman who had unleashed this torrent of fear, humiliation, and now, public scrutiny upon her. The realization hit Danielle like a physical blow. This wasn't just about a misunderstanding, a case of mistaken identity. This was about something deeper, something more insidious. This was about the ingrained prejudice that saw her a decorated veteran, a homeowner, a dog owner, a person as inherently suspicious simply because of the color of her skin. The casual indifference on Kimberlyn's face in the video was a stark contrast to the tearful apology she'd offered later, an apology that now felt hollow, performative. Did she even understand the gravity of what she'd done? Danielle wondered, a bitter taste rising in her throat. Did she understand the fear that gripped her, the cold steel of the gun barrels pointed at her chest, the chilling realization that her life could have ended right there in her own driveway? The video ended, but the image of Kimberlyn's face, frozen in that mask of indifference, lingered in Danielle's mind. The quiet anger she'd felt before now flared into something hotter, more potent. It was an anger fueled not just by her own experience, but by the countless others who had faced similar injustices, whose stories often went untold, unheard. She closed her eyes, trying to push away the image, but it was no use. The video, now viral, was out there for the world to see, a stark reminder of the reality she lived in. A reality where a simple trip to the grocery store could turn into a life-or-death situation. The weight of it all pressed down on her, heavy and suffocating. She thought of Rex and Nova, their unwavering loyalty, their silent strength. They had been her shield, their presence a deterrent that had likely prevented the situation from escalating further. She reached down and stroked their soft fur, the familiar texture a small comfort in the storm raging inside her. This can't be the end, she thought, a flicker of resolve igniting within her. This can't be the story they tell about me. The fear began to recede, replaced by a steely determination. She would not be silenced. She would not be another statistic. She would fight. For herself, for her community, for every black person who had ever been unjustly targeted, profiled, and judged based on the color of their skin. This video, this incident would not break her. It would become her weapon. The setting sun cast long shadows across the room, painting the walls in hues of orange and purple. The hum of the refrigerator seemed louder now, a steady rhythm in the otherwise silent house. Danielle opened her eyes, the reflection of the setting sun burning in their depths. The fear was gone, replaced by a quiet fire, a burning ember of resolve. She had a story to tell, and the world was about to hear it. She reached for her phone, her fingers hovering over the screen. It was time to fight back. The world exploded. Not literally, of course, but the quiet sanctuary of Danielle's life shattered into a million sharp, glittering fragments, each a reflection of the incident in her driveway. The video, shaky and raw, captured by old Mr. Yates' trembling hand, had somehow found its way online. Now it was everywhere. Her face, etched with disbelief and burgeoning anger, stared back at her from news websites, social media feeds, and even the garish screen of the gas station pump. The headline, stark and accusatory, seemed to follow her like a shadow. Veteran homeowner confronted by police in her own driveway. Military canines may have prevented tragedy. The words tasted like ash in her mouth. Tragedy, as if she, a decorated veteran, a homeowner, a woman simply unloading groceries in her own driveway, was the source of potential disaster. She scrolled through the endless comments, a churning vortex of outrage, support, and vitriol. Some recognized the injustice, their words blazing with righteous anger. Others, cloaked in anonymity, spewed hateful rhetoric, questioning her service, her character, her very right to exist. The sheer volume of it was overwhelming, a tidal wave of opinion crashing against the fragile shores of her composure. This isn't real, she thought, rubbing her temples, the throbbing a steady drumbeat against the cacophony in her head. This can't be happening. The Modesto Police Department issued a statement, a carefully worded non-apology that acknowledged the unfortunate incident, while simultaneously justifying the officer's actions. Responding to a call from a concerned citizen, the statement read, neatly sidestepping the blatant racism at the core of the situation. No one from the department had contacted her directly. No apology, no explanation, no acknowledgement of the terror they'd inflicted. Just a sterile press release, designed to appease the public and protect the institution. The silence felt like a second assault, a cold, calculated dismissal. Days blurred into a relentless cycle of media requests, phone calls from lawyers, and the suffocating weight of public scrutiny. Her home, once her sanctuary, now felt like a fishbowl. Reporters camped outside her gate, their cameras flashing like predatory eyes, hungry for a soundbite, a tear, a glimpse of the traumatized veteran. She kept the curtains drawn, the silence inside a stark contrast to the buzzing chaos outside. Rex and Nova, sensing her unease, stayed close, their warm bodies a comforting presence against the chill of fear that clung to her. She stroked their fur, the rhythmic motion a small anchor in the storm. They saw it, she thought, her gaze meeting Rex's steady brown eyes. They saw the fear in my eyes, the guns pointed at my chest. They knew. The weight of it all pressed down on her, heavy and suffocating. The constant replay of the incident in her mind, the insidious whispers of self-doubt, the gnawing fear that this would define her, that she would forever be the woman in the video. She found herself staring at her reflection, searching for the cracks, the evidence of the damage. Was this what it meant to be black in America? To be constantly on guard, constantly having to prove your worth, your innocence, your very right to breathe? A flicker of anger, hot and sharp, pierced through the numbness. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about all the others, the countless black men and women who had faced similar, and often far worse, encounters with law enforcement. The faces of Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Sandra Bland, and so many others flashed through her mind, their stories a grim reminder of the systemic racism that permeated the very fabric of society. No, a voice whispered inside her, a voice that grew stronger with each passing day. This ends here. The media attention, initially focused on the dramatic footage of the dogs, began to shift. Legal experts weighed in, dissecting the officer's actions, highlighting the lack of probable cause, the excessive force, the blatant racial profiling. The narrative evolved from a sensationalized story about hero dogs to a sobering examination of systemic racism within the police department. The hashtag #StandWithDanielle began trending, a groundswell of support rising from the ashes of the incident. The pressure mounted on Mayor Raburn. His initial statement, a carefully crafted expression of concern and a promise to investigate the matter thoroughly, rang hollow in the face of the growing public outcry. A town hall meeting was scheduled, a platform for the community to voice their concerns and demand accountability. Danielle received a call from the mayor's office, a belated invitation to speak at the meeting. She hesitated. The thought of facing the public, of reliving the trauma under the harsh glare of the spotlight, filled her with dread. But then she thought of Rex and Nova, their unwavering loyalty, their silent strength. She thought of the countless others who had been silenced, whose stories had been erased. She took a deep breath, the air filling her lungs with a newfound resolve. Yes, she said, her voice steady and clear. "I will speak." The fear hadn't vanished, but it no longer held her captive. It was time to tell her story, not as a victim, but as a survivor. It was time to demand change. The air in Mayor Raburn's office was thick, not with the scent of old books and leather that Danielle had half expected, but with something artificial, like overripe melon and disinfectant. It clung to the back of her throat. The room itself was a study in calculated neutrality, beige walls, a dark wood desk polished to an unnatural sheen, and framed, generic landscapes that offered nothing to the eye. Danielle sat stiffly in one of the plush visitors' chairs, the fabric clinging uncomfortably to the back of her thighs. She could feel the phantom weight of Rex and Nova, her Malinois, flanking her, though they waited patiently outside with Officer Perez. The mayor, a man whose smile didn't quite reach his eyes, sat behind the large desk, his hands steepled before him. "Ms. Rucker," he began, his voice smooth as the desk surface, "I wanted to personally apologize for the unfortunate incident that occurred at your residence." He paused, as if searching for the right words. "The Modesto Police Department deeply regrets any distress caused." Danielle's fingers tightened around the strap of her purse. Distress? She thought, the word a bland, tasteless substitute for the terror that had gripped her. Regret? That was a politician's word, hollow and devoid of true remorse. "Regret doesn't erase the image of guns pointed at me in my own driveway." She wanted to snap, but held back. She needed to control this narrative. "Mayor Raburn," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor that ran through her. "An apology is a start, but it doesn't explain why your officers felt justified in drawing their weapons on an unarmed woman, a veteran, in her own home." The mayor shifted in his chair, the polished wood creaking beneath him. "We are currently reviewing the officer's body cam footage and conducting a thorough internal investigation," he assured her. "Additional training will be implemented to address any implicit biases." Implicit biases, Danielle echoed internally. The phrase felt like a shield, deflecting true accountability. It was a convenient label for something far more insidious, something that ran deep in the very marrow of the system. It wasn't just bias. It was fear, a primal fear of anything that deviated from the perceived norm. In this case, the norm was not her. "Training?" she asked, her voice rising slightly. The scent of melon and disinfectant suddenly felt suffocating. "Training won't erase the fear I felt, the humiliation. It won't erase the fact that if my dogs hadn't been there," she paused, the image of Rex and Nova, their bodies tense but controlled, flashing through her mind. They were her silent protectors, her shield against a world that saw her skin as a threat. "It happened right in front of my own garage. And if my dogs hadn't been there, I'm not sure I'd be here either." The mayor's smile faltered. He opened his mouth to speak, but Danielle cut him off. She was done with carefully chosen words and performative apologies. The controlled composure she had maintained began to crack, revealing the raw anger simmering beneath. "You talk about training, about implicit bias. But what about the explicit bias? The fear that fueled that 911 call. The fear that made your officers jump to conclusions." She leaned forward, her gaze unwavering. "My dogs, trained military working dogs, showed more restraint than your officers. They sensed a threat, yes, but they didn't escalate the situation. They didn't draw weapons. They waited, they observed. They protected me." She took a deep breath, forcing herself to regain control. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every black person who had ever been unjustly targeted, every veteran who had served their country only to be treated like a criminal on their own soil. "This isn't an isolated incident, Mayor Raburn," she continued, her voice resonating with a quiet power. "This is a symptom of a larger disease, a disease that infects your police department, your city, and this entire country. You can offer apologies, you can promise training, but until you acknowledge the deep-seated racism that allows these things to happen, nothing will change." The silence in the room stretched, broken only by the faint hum of the air conditioning. The mayor's face was unreadable, the carefully constructed mask of composure finally slipping. He looked, for the first time, genuinely shaken. Danielle knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that this was just the beginning. The video of the incident, captured by her neighbor Mr. Yates, had gone viral. The world had seen, and they were watching, waiting for real action, not just empty words. The fight was far from over, but in that sterile, melon-scented office, a seed of change had been planted. It was a small seed, fragile and vulnerable, but it held the potential to grow into something powerful, something that could finally break through the concrete of indifference and bloom into true justice. The fluorescent lights of the John Muir Community Center hummed, a dull counterpoint to the restless murmur of the crowd. Danielle sat near the back, the hard plastic chair digging into her thighs. She hadn't intended to speak. She'd come to listen, to gauge the temperature of her town, to see if her video, had shifted anything. The air, thick with the scent of stale coffee and anxious perspiration, pressed against her like a physical weight. Each cough, each shuffle of feet, grated on her nerves, amplifying the turmoil within. Just listen, Danielle. Observe. You don't have to do anything. Yet, a restless energy thrummed beneath her skin. Her hands, clasped tightly in her lap, felt clammy. Mayor Raburn stood at the podium, his face a carefully constructed mask of concern. His words, polished and practiced, echoed the now familiar rhetoric of regret and promises of change. Danielle's gaze drifted to the floor, the swirling pattern of the linoleum a dizzying distraction. Performative, all performative. The mayor's voice faded into the background noise, a meaningless drone. She thought of Rex and Nova, their steady presence a stark contrast to the performative apologies. Their unwavering loyalty, their silent understanding, were a balm to her raw nerves. A woman in the audience, her face contorted with anger, rose to speak. Her voice, trembling with emotion, recounted a similar incident from years past. Another voice joined in, then another, each story a testament to a pattern of injustice. Danielle's breath hitched. A knot tightened in her chest. She recognized the pain in their voices, the weary resignation, the flicker of hope that this time, maybe this time, things would be different. The room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in. The hum of the fluorescent lights intensified, morphing into a high-pitched whine. I need to get out of here. The thought pulsed in her mind, a desperate urge to escape this suffocating atmosphere. She started to rise, her legs shaky, when a young girl, no older than 12, approached the microphone. Her voice, small but clear, cut through the noise. "Why do they keep doing this?" she asked, her eyes wide with confusion and hurt. The question, so simple yet so profound, hung in the air. Danielle sank back in her chair, the girl's words resonating deep within her. The knot in her chest loosened, replaced by a surge of something she hadn't felt since the incident anger. Not the hot, blinding rage that had threatened to consume her in those terrifying moments in her driveway, but a cold, hard anger fueled by years of accumulated injustices, both big and small. This is why we have to speak up. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. The memory of Officer Perez's face, a mixture of fear and confusion mirroring her own, flashed through her mind. Even in the midst of her own terror, she had seen a flicker of humanity in his eyes. He's part of the system, but he's also a victim of it. The thought gave her a strange sense of clarity. This wasn't just about her. It was about all of them. When she opened her eyes, the room seemed to shift back into focus. The murmuring of the crowd faded, the oppressive air lightened. She rose, her legs steady now, and walked toward the microphone. The room fell silent as she approached the podium. She could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes on her, a palpable pressure. She placed her hands on the cool metal stand, grounding herself. For a moment, she couldn't speak. Her throat felt tight, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. What am I doing? Doubt gnawed at her. Then, she remembered the girl's question. Why do they keep doing this? The question echoed in her mind, pushing away the doubt, replacing it with a steely resolve. She took another deep breath, and began to speak. "My name is Danielle Rucker," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I'm a veteran. I serve this country. I came home expecting to feel safe, to feel protected. Instead," she paused, the unspoken words hanging heavy in the air. "Instead, I was met with guns drawn in my own driveway." She recounted the incident, her voice even and controlled, the details stark and unflinching. She described the fear, the confusion, the chilling realization that her life was in danger, not from a foreign enemy, but from the very people sworn to protect her. "I stayed calm," she said, her voice rising slightly, "because people like me don't get the luxury of panic. We don't get to react. We have to respond. Carefully, deliberately, because any wrong move, any perceived threat, could be our last." She looked out at the crowd, her gaze meeting the eyes of the young girl who had asked the question. "This isn't about one bad cop or one bad neighbor," she continued. "This is about a system that sees us as a threat before it sees us as human beings. This is about the fear and prejudice that are woven into the fabric of our society." Her voice resonated with a quiet power, a strength born of pain and resilience. "I'm here tonight not just to share my story, but to demand change. We need to do better. We have to do better." The silence that followed her words was profound. Then a single clap broke the stillness, followed by another and another, until the room erupted in applause. Danielle stood at the podium, bathed in the warmth of the applause, a flicker of hope igniting within her. Perhaps, just perhaps, this time things would be different. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Danielle's porch, painting the weathered wood in hues of amber and gold. A week had passed since the town forum, a week since her voice, amplified by the microphone, had echoed through the hushed hall, carrying the weight of her experience, the weight of 1,000 untold stories. A week since the world had watched Rex and Nova, silent sentinels, hold a mirror to the ingrained biases of a system meant to protect. She ran a hand over the smooth, cool surface of the ceramic mug, the warmth of the chamomile tea seeping into her palm. The scent, floral and earthy, was a small comfort, a grounding presence in the swirling vortex of the past days. The media storm had finally begun to subside, the constant barrage of calls and messages slowing to a trickle. The quiet, broken only by the gentle hum of bees in her lavender bushes, was a balm to her frayed nerves. A flicker of movement at the edge of her vision drew her gaze. Rex and Nova lay sprawled on the porch, their brindle coats gleaming in the dappled sunlight. Rex, ever vigilant, lifted his head, his dark eyes meeting hers with an intensity that belied his calm demeanor. A silent understanding passed between them, a bond forged in shared experiences, in the crucible of that tense afternoon. He lowered his head back to his paws, a low rumble vibrating in his chest, a sound she recognized as contentment. It mirrored her own unexpected sense of peace. The forum hadn't brought immediate, sweeping change. She knew that, but there were small signs, subtle shifts in the tectonic plates of her community. A few neighbors, faces she'd seen countless times but never exchanged a word with, had stopped by, their apologies hesitant but sincere. Mrs. Fallner, her face etched with shame, had left a basket of muffins on her doorstep, a gesture that felt more like penance than reconciliation. Danielle hadn't touched them. Forgiveness was a journey, not a destination, and she wasn't there yet. But the fact that Mrs. Fallner had tried, that she had recognized the ugliness of her fear, was a start. Her phone buzzed, a notification from an old army buddy, Marcus. They hadn't spoken in years. He'd seen the video, he wrote, and it had sparked a difficult but necessary conversation with his 10-year-old daughter. He thanked her, not for her trauma, but for the unintended lesson it had imparted. A lesson about seeing, really seeing, the world through another's eyes. A lesson about the insidious nature of prejudice, the quiet ways it warped perceptions and fueled fear. Danielle reread the message, a strange tightness constricting her chest. It wasn't the familiar knot of anxiety, but something else, something akin to awe, laced with a profound sadness. Marcus's words echoed a sentiment she'd heard whispered in the online comments, in the hushed conversations of the grocery store. Her experience, raw and exposed for the world to see, had become a catalyst. It had cracked open a space for dialogue, for uncomfortable truths to surface, for the insidious whispers of bias to be challenged. "Sometimes," she murmured, the words barely audible above the drone of the cicadas, "it takes one moment a silent dog to hold up a mirror to the world." The words, spoken to the empty air, hung heavy with meaning. She hadn't sought this unwanted spotlight, this burden of representation. She hadn't asked to become the poster child for systemic racism. But here she was, her life irrevocably altered, her quiet existence shattered. Yet, in the fragments, she saw a glimmer of hope, a possibility for change. She thought of Officer Perez, the flicker of remorse in his eyes during their brief encounter at the forum. He hadn't spoken to her directly, but she'd seen it, that internal struggle between ingrained training and a dawning awareness. It was a small crack in the monolith, a sign that even within the system, change could take root. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of lavender and rose. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of damp earth and jasmine. Rex and Nova rose, stretching their powerful limbs, their movements fluid and graceful. They nudged her hands, their warm breath against her skin a comforting presence. They didn't need words, didn't need explanations. They understood. They always did. Danielle leaned against the porch railing, the wood rough beneath her fingertips. The world felt different now, sharper, more defined. The shadows seemed deeper, the light more precious. She knew the road ahead would be long, fraught with challenges. The fight for justice, for equality, was a marathon, not a sprint. But she wasn't alone. She had her dogs, her community, and the quiet power of her story. And that, she realized, was enough. It had to be. The silence of her dogs had spoken volumes, and the world was finally starting to listen.